Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining us again. Welcome to what episode we're on. Welcome to episode 16 of Dissemination Day. And today, to sort of follow up from Tia's last Dissemination Day video looking at the Hasiotis paper, we thought it would be useful to focus in on some research papers that instead found a really positive impact caused by PBS implementation. So the one that we're going to be looking at today is a paper that was published in the Research in Developmental Disabilities journal back in 2018. It was by Peter McGill and a range of different researchers. And the title of the paper is Reducing Challenging Behaviour of Adults with Intellectual Disabilities in Supported Accommodation, a cluster randomized controlled trial of setting-wide positive behaviour support. So this is a paper, as the name suggests, that focuses in on the approach of system-wide implementation of positive behaviour support. So in contrast to the paper published by Hasiotis and the other authors, this paper focuses in on actually, getting in there and implementing PBS from a system-wide perspective, not simply on training some staff that then go in and implement PBS potentially. There were some questions following on from that paper as to how far they'd implemented those approaches that they were trained in. So the sort of context around this research paper, as I say, it's sort of based on some of the concerns that were brought up from within the Hasiotis paper. It's talking about the fact that generally challenging behaviour has been treated as a single problem requiring intervention by professionals. So this idea that positive behaviour support is a standalone intervention rather than a framework, and this idea that a single professional can come in and use some PBS to magically remove the problem entirely. This instead is focusing on the framework of positive behaviour support and how this framework can be used from a system-wide perspective to make some real positive and lasting changes to the people that are living within the services. It's sort of based upon some of the work that's been done around the school-wide positive behaviour support implementation, which focuses on the prevention of challenging behaviours, as opposed to actually focusing in on sort of individual interventions when challenging behaviour occurs. So the authors of the paper actually use this quote from Carr back in 2007 that states a central independent variable in PBS is systems change. So as I say, they're really, really focusing on the fact that this is an intervention that's system-wide. So the primary hypothesis within this research paper was that setting-wide positive behaviour support intervention will be associated with reductions in challenging behaviour. So that was the primary hypothesis, the main area that they were focusing in on. But they also thought it would be really important to focus in on other elements. We know that positive behaviour support isn't simply focusing around challenging behaviour or reducing restrictive practices. A primary focus for positive behaviour support is actually around, quality of life. So the secondary hypothesis was that setting-wide positive behaviour support intervention will result in improved quality of support and better quality of life. So what they did, this was a randomized control trial study. So this is where there are two independent groups which are randomly allocated to either an experimental condition or a control condition. So this study took place within one single organisation that run a range of supported living settings. The settings that were selected for this particular research were settings that supported people that had a recent history of frequent or severe challenging behaviour. The services were then randomly allocated to either an experimental condition where they received the intervention that we're going to discuss in a little while, or a control condition where business carried on as usual. So they still received access to the usual amount of input. Input wasn't withdrawn for these services, but they didn't gain access to this additional intervention. The intervention that was used within the study used the principles of positive behaviour support to improve the quality of practice within experimental group settings. So there's a real focus on systemically improving the practice within those experimental settings. There was a huge focus on enriching the environment, on upskilling the staff that were supporting the individuals in those environments, improving the quality of the services as a whole. They started with a 3-hour briefing for the managers that were overseeing those services, so that they sort of understood the expectations of being part of this experiment. And then a week took place in which detailed observations were carried out by 2 experimenters per setting. The experimenters had conversations with the staff that were working in those settings, with the people being supported, and they also reviewed a large amount of the documentation within those services. And the findings were then organised into 8 different areas based on research that identifies their link with challenging behaviour. So these 8 distinct areas were the areas of focus within this study. And these are broken down, I put them here on a side for you, into these 8 different categories, which are again detailed within the research paper as well. And broken down, if you want to actually look at the research paper yourself, they're broken down in a lot more detail around actually what each of those areas constituted. So the first one was a focus on activities and skill development. And this looked at scheduling of varied activities, fitting with individual routines, that kind of thing, and also on actually skilling people up, getting people out to work. Service management looked at actually making sure that there were enough staff within the service, that the managers were skilled enough, and that staff members within the service had access to regular supervision and good quality practice leadership as well. The physical environment just simply focused on the environment in which people were living, the physical house or access to a garden or access to transport. There was a focus on the relationships that person had with family and with others, and how those could be enriched and improved. Service staff, how well trained those staff were in the specifics related to the people that they were being supported, and factors related to their well-being. Communication and social interaction, so how staff could engage positively with the people that they were supporting and enable them to communicate their needs effectively and communicate to them. Health, obviously focusing on things like diet and exercise, regular access to health care, and also around things like personal care. And then wider organisation, this focused in on the clarity and staff understanding of organisational policies, and the support that was being delivered to staff and to managers from the wider organisation. So these were the 8 areas that were focused upon. And following on from a detailed week spent auditing and observing those services, an action plan was drawn out that specifically focused on each of those 8 areas. This sort of makes me think about, we've been talking a lot recently in training around these 3 tiers that you find within the model of school-wide PBS. Down the bottom here we've got our universal level, which is where we put in place our basic everyday quality of life interventions that are actually in place to support people to flourish, to actually get the most out of their lives. Supplementary and targeted interventions are only necessary for those people who've got a higher level of need and require that greater intensity of assessment and intervention. And what you too often find is that PBS resources are directed to the higher level people within this hierarchy. The tier 3 or the tier 2 individuals get the most input, and there's not enough focus on actually building that lower tier, that universal tier of support that enables people to flourish. And I think the intervention that's being used in this research that we're talking about here is actually really focusing in on that tier 1 support, that universal support. So it's a really great demonstration of what that might potentially look like, and the way that it's been broken down into those 8 areas based upon research, I think is really, really effective and really promising. So the eight areas were broken down into specific standards, and the average was 145 standards per service that managers needed to work on with their teams, which to me, feels like I think as a manager, if someone came in and said, you've got these 145 things to work on, I'd find that quite overwhelming. But as you see from the results, there were some really, really positive outcomes. Monthly meetings were taking place during which those outcomes were scored, and they were used. A simple criteria really was used for scoring: and not achieved, partly achieved, or fully achieved. A sort of a periodic service review style approach to scoring those standards. not necessarily based around sort of punitive approaches if those standards weren't met, but simply monitoring where each service was at achieving those standards. Alongside that, coaching was taking place for the staff and for the manager that were working in these settings. The development went into actually developing real functional documentation, because it was mentioned within the paper that a lot of the services had documentation that didn't really necessarily serve a function, but was using up a lot of time and a lot of resources. So streamlining that documentation was part of this process. Staff members were given access to training as required, depending on what had been found during that assessment period. They utilised the existing company resources and any external teams as needed. So this is a company that's got its own sort of behaviour support team who were utilised, to support in particular focused areas. Experimenters gave the services support with chasing, sort of things that maybe organisationally weren't being provided. And then towards the end of the intervention, the experimenters faded their presence out, so they sort of handed over the support they were providing to the services in an aim to make sure that their impact, the impact of this particular intervention, really did maintain after they removed their input. The control group, as we discussed a little bit earlier, it's a randomized control trial, so there's two different groups. The control group of settings received no additional input, but as I said earlier on, they did have access to the normal level of support. So if they needed support from the behaviour support team, that was still provided, but it was no additional intervention. This graph shows the month-on-month achievement of these outcome standards that were set during that observation period. So month on month, you can see the enormous sort of increase in the progress that services were making between month 1 and month 11. But overall, woohoo, huge achievement here. 80.1% of the standards were achieved at the point at which the experimenters faded their presence out. So when you think that there's an average of 145 standards per service, that's an enormous achievement, really enormous achievement. So you'd expect from that there to be some really positive outcomes in relation to that kind of input. So we'll have a little bit of a look at what was measured and at actually what the outcomes were for the people being supported. So our dependent variables here, so things being measured. First of all, we were the aberrant behaviour checklist, and this was used to measure the levels of challenging behaviour that were occurring. There was also an observation tool that focused in on engagement in meaningful activity and relationships. This was implemented during 2-hour observations and was used to assess levels of engagement as a measure of quality of life, really. And the active support measure was carried out at the end of that 2-hour observation period, and this was used to assess the quality of staff support during this period. There was also at the end of the process a 1-page bespoke questionnaire that was carried out with the staff, with family members and with professionals who'd had input within those settings. And this was used to assess the social validity of this intervention. So these measures were carried out, aside from the social validity measure, which was carried out towards the end, the other measures were carried out at baseline prior to the intervention being implemented. They were also carried out 3 to 6 months post-intervention, so after the intervention had ceased, 3 to 6 months following that. And then there was a follow-up at 12 to 18 months, which I think is great because we're looking at actually whether that intervention the effects of it have maintained. So there was a follow-up sort of probe as well at 12 to 18 months. So let's have a look at these rather lovely graphs because they show really, really lovely things. The first one we've got here is the ABC scores graph, which is actually looking at the level of challenging behaviour at baseline, post, which is 3 to 6 months, and then at the 12 to 18 month follow-up. And we can see here in blue, which is our experimental condition, there is clearly a reduction in challenging behaviour. There was a slight reduction in the control group between the pre and post measures, but there's a significant difference between the two groups. So the experimental group demonstrated a significantly greater reduction in challenging behaviour than the control group, which is a really, really wonderful outcome. In total, the challenging behaviour reduced by 2/3 in the experimental group, which it's not something to be taken lightly. I think it's a really brilliant outcome. Looking as well at the active support measure score, so this measure was used to assess the quality of staff support being provided. You can also see that there's an increase in the score, the active support measure scores for the experimental group, but not for the control group. And again, this was a significant difference. So it's statistically significant difference between the two groups in terms of quality of staff support after the intervention. The other measure that was used to assess engagement as a measure of quality of life, it did actually show an increase in engagement, but this was found not to be statistically significant. So it's not sort of been addressed here. But I think, it still is, I would say, quite likely that if challenging behaviour is reducing, if quality of staff support is increasing, then you would imagine that the quality of the people's lives that were living in those services would indeed be improving. But unfortunately, the results in this particular case didn't find that it was statistically significant. So a wonderful, I would say, little study. It's not a little study. It was a massive undertaking. But it's really wonderful to see the impact of this sort of system-wide implementation of positive behaviour support. So some of the sort of thoughts that came up within the discussion of this paper, first of all, focused on the fact that it was a randomized control trial. As Tia mentioned in the last dissemination day, this is the gold standard in terms of research. There's very few non-pharmacological randomised control trials being carried out, so very few are within the area of positive behaviour support. So to have a significant result within one of these sorts of studies is particularly great. It's particularly sort of powerful. It's emphasising the impact of system-wide rather than individual intervention. So none of the intervention that was covered here within this study focused in on particular forms of intervention for particular people. It focused in on the environmental enrichment from a system-wide perspective. So it's actually emphasising the power and the importance of implementing positive behaviour support from that, within that framework, from a wider systemic point of view. And the intervention itself was greeted really positively as well by staff, by professionals and by family members. And it's not sort of mentioned within the paper, how it was greeted specifically by the people that were being supported. But you'd like to think that with all of these things improving, that it would have also been greeted positively by the most important people in this, the people being supported in those services. Some of the potential limitations or areas for sort of further research that were pulled up on. First of all, it may have been useful to monitor the input that was actually being given to the control settings. So while actually there was a significant difference between the two groups, it wasn't assessed how much behaviour support team intervention those control settings had access to. So it's possible, as in the Hasiotis paper, where we found that actually the control group were receiving a high level of positive behaviour support input. That could have also been the case here, because that wasn't necessarily monitored. But I think the fact that there was a significant difference between the two groups makes that potentially unlikely. Also, the research is focusing on the inevitable variability that's kind of been introduced by that high level of staff turnover that you find within all social care settings. And actually, if that level of staff turnover could be addressed, would the effects of this intervention be even more powerful, even more wonderful for the people being supported? They also talk about the fact that it would be useful to focus on more than one social care provider. So as I mentioned earlier on, this research took place within one single provider. The researchers, obviously did that for a reason. It sort of helped in terms of some of the consistency and some of the logistics in terms of getting these things implemented. But actually using other, a range of different social care providers would have been able to test how well those findings generalised from provider to provider. And also it would have potentially helped to identify some of the organisational characteristics that support successful intervention. So the things that are really great about the places that do it well, what are they great at, what areas are really important to actually lead to successful implementation, and that can then be replicated, and we'll learn a great deal from that. And they also talk about the fact that it might be useful to find an alternative means of measuring quality of life. And we know that quality of life is one of the most difficult things to actually be able to define and measure, because it's person specific. So it's about actually how you can find an effective measure of the quality of life across a wide group, and that's one particular difficulty. I talk about the fact that it highlights the need to focus on, going forward, a much more systemic and preventative intervention programme for places. So not simply focusing in on those individual interventions, but taking a much more systemic, preventative approach to positive behaviour support. Alongside that, if you look back at the tiers at school-wide PBS, the triangle, that I'll pop up on the screen for you again now. If we can get those core strategies right in tier 1, then it will reduce the likelihood that we need to be using those more targeted, intensive interventions for the people that potentially escalate to that level of challenging behaviour. So we need to get that bottom tier right, and the results of this research really, really support that point, which I think is great. It also highlights the fact that it's possible to reduce challenging behaviour through interventions focused on environmental context. So not simply focusing in on the individual and what we need to change about that individual, but focusing on the wider environment and what we need to change within that environment to have a real positive impact upon that person's quality of life, and as a result, their levels of challenging behaviour. So in conclusion, awesome study, really positive. It's lovely to sort of read a study that's so conclusive in its results around the impact of positive behaviour support, which obviously from our perspective is massively brilliant, really. So not sure what the plan is for the next sort of Dissemination Day video, but we'll keep you posted on that, and hopefully you found this really useful. I'd urge you to get that paper in front of you and have a good read, because I think there's lots of value to be taken from it. I think it's a really, really positive and informative research paper. So anyway, have a good rest of your day, and I'll see you again soon. Bye.